Amber Roberts is a recent graduate in applied economics through the University of Minnesota College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resources. Her research focused on analyzing how dairy farmers' decisions at the cow level impacts the farm's financial health. She now serves as an ag business management extension educator for the University of Minnesota. Amber was a recipient of an NMPF scholarship last year for her important work studying what she will be discussing today, which is the financial resilience of dairy farms. Amber, you are free to start sharing your screen now.
Great, thanks, Teresa. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yep.
Perfect. I can't see all of you, but hello and welcome. We're going to be talking today about factors influencing resilient dairies. So to give you a little bit of background, like Teresa explained, this was part of research that was conducted through my master's thesis last year. I worked in conjunction with Dr. Jolene Hadridge. And really what we wanted to understand here with this building resilient dairy farms is to understand, is resiliency a product of herd management or farm finances? And then what are some of those factors that influence financial resiliency on dairy farms? But before we dive in, I would like to get to know a little bit more about all of you. So if you have a cell phone with you, feel free to text Amber Roberts 416. That's Amber Roberts 416, no spaces, to 37607. And if you don't, that's okay. Go ahead and type it into the chat bar. But just to start off with, love to know, tell me your name, where you are located, so we can kind of get a sense of where folks are from. No responses quite yet. Oh, there we go. Emily from Michigan. Hello, Emily. Beth from Michigan. Okay, Michigan representing. We have Josh, Cannon Falls, Minnesota. Isabel from Vermont. Very nice. Kim from New York. Wow. Garrett from Texas. Hello. Grace from New York, welcome. Ashley from Michigan. Paul from Minnesota. Cash from Florida, very nice. Okay, great. Well, folks from Vermont, Virginia, very nice. Welcome, welcome. Maine. Great, we'll let a few more responses come in. If you want to keep that up, we'll do a couple more of these interactive throughout the presentation to get the blood pumping and just so that we're not talking straight at you the whole time. So welcome everyone. Sounds like we have Minnesota, Michigan, Maine, Missouri, Virginia, Vermont, New York, folks from all over. So welcome. So before we dive in, a little bit about myself. Like Teresa had just shared, I'm originally from Montana. You can see a picture of my state out there. I went to Montana State University and then I came out to the Midwest. I worked for a dairy co-op down in Wisconsin before I went on to get my master's and study farm finance and specifically dairy finance. And while we don't have very many dairy farms in Montana, my tie to the dairy industry is that black and white photo are two of my uncles. And so my grandparents owned a dairy farm out in Minnesota for quite some time. And that was always fun to visit growing up. So to give you some idea of why we started doing this research, when I came to Minnesota in 2018, Minnesota had just over 2,700 dairy farms. In that year alone, Minnesota lost a substantial number of dairy farms and actually dropped to under 2,500 dairy farms in one single year. So 2019, we saw a 10.2% of dairy farms in Minnesota close their doors down. And a lot of talking about, right? Obviously, Minnesota, we sell a lot of class 3 milk price or class 3 milk. And you can see that there was some extreme volatility that had occurred over the last 10 years. But the period that we're going to be talking about in this study today, which is 2012 to 2018, really experienced some extreme changes in class 3 milk prices. In fact, they experienced the largest 6-month decline in milk prices in the history of class 3 milk prices. And you can see that in that gray line. So all of these changes had led us to hearing from Minnesota dairy farmers and also dairy farmers all over the US that they had some very specific needs. One, they wanted to stay in business. They didn't want to have to close their doors. But in order to do that, they would need to improve their profit margins. And also, they really wanted some empirical recommendations from other dairy farms in their state, from other dairy farms down the road. They wanted to know, what are their neighbors doing that is keeping them afloat? And how can they apply that into their farm's financial situation and into how they're managing their farm? So these were some of the wants that we saw from our dairy farmers in Minnesota. So ultimately, the study goal here was to identify what are the characteristics of resilient farms that impact that financial health, right? So what are those specific factors that make certain farms profitable in times of high prices and low prices, and make other farms not? So in order to do this, we were very lucky. We got to have a collaborative partnership. And so this was one of the first studies to be able to use both Finbin data, which is the largest farm financial data set in the United States, and DHIA data. So we had farmers agree to give us their individual cow data through DHIA and also give us access to their farm's financial data. And the nice thing about Finbin data is that it is checked by a farm business management institution. We know that those numbers are accurate and that they've been looked over each year by a group of experts, just to make sure that there are no outliers. In total, we had 90 Minnesota dairy herds agree to participate in this study. Not all of them could, but the majority did. And they gave us their information all the way from 2012 to 2018. Our dairy herds ranged from about 22 cows at the smallest, all the way up to just over 1,000. And in total, we had over 35,000 dairy cows involved in this study that we were able to gather information from. So the objective here was, we didn't know how to merge farm level and cow level data. In theory, it seems like it should be simple, but it gets very complicated when you're talking about farm level finances. And how do you pair that with individual cow data? Throughout this study, we used a both-and approach. We wanted to use both data sets, be able to merge them together to get a more comprehensive understanding of the farm's financial situation and how they're using different production management techniques. We also wanted to make sure that when we're combining these, that we're being realistic. Not every cow has the same impact on that farm's financial statement. So we used a few different methods to make sure that we were actually capturing that sensitivity. Some cows cost more, eat more food. Some cows generate more revenue. And then we also wanted to be able to put out recommendations, analyze the impact of farm characteristics on resiliency, and which ones are the most likely to affect a farm's resiliency. So we've talked a lot about resilient farms, but when we started into this study, we didn't really necessarily have a definition of what a resilient farm was. So I'm going to have all of you text back in. Tell me, how would you define resiliency if you were given this question of what's a financially resilient farm? Go ahead and text just a few words if you want, and we'll watch as they pop up on the screen. We'll give it 12 more seconds, and if they don't pop up, we'll keep moving along. It happens. I'm sure we all know Zoom and technology sometimes don't go as we expect. that is a-okay. So you're all thinking in your head how you would define, oh, there we go, year, livability, make, profit. Right, so all of these things could be and fall into that resiliency category. So we had a challenge of coming up with, one, how are we going to define resiliency? And then two, how are we going to measure that definition? So looking at the research that was already available, there were a lot of different definitions of resiliency, especially when it comes to farm finance and to dairies. The ability to retain the operations function, to absorb and recover from shocks, to maintain productive capacity in the face of variability. So all of these were good definitions, but none of them necessarily told us, how do we measure resiliency? So we came up with our own definition to measure resiliency. Farms that fell into the top 25% for the majority of production years were considered resilient. And this was measured using farm finance. So we looked at 3 different measurements. The first we looked at was the adjusted net farm income ratio. And why we did this is we wanted to know year over year, how was that farm performing? So this is essentially a measure of short-term resiliency. And if that farm for the majority of those 7 years that we were studying fell into the top 25% compared to those other 87 farms that we were looking at, then they were considered resilient. We also looked at our rate of return on asset, which is that long-term resiliency measure. So based on the assets that you have, how much additional can you generate each year? And then lastly, we looked at our resilient under both measures. So there were 16 farms that were found to be resilient, both under our adjusted net farm income ratio and under our rate of return on asset. So we said if your farm for the majority of years using these financial measures fell into the top 25%, you were classified as a resilient farm. And then we needed to know, so we've identified who our resilient farms are, but is there truly a difference between resilient and non-resilient farms? We found yes, there was. Resilient farms were statistically different than non-resilient farms. So some characteristics that we found, 24 of the 87 farms were resilient using, and I'm going to be talking about our adjusted net farm income here. So about 28% of those farms were resilient. On average, our resilient farms made $86,000 in net farm income, which was $15,000 more than our non-resilient farms. We had a surprising mixture of herd sizes. But for our resilient farms, only 2 out of those 24 farms had more than 500 cows. The rest of them had under 250 cows, which kind of went against what we had been hearing, that small farms can't be resilient, that small farms can't, over time and over these high and low milk prices that we experienced from 2012 to 2018, can't remain profitable. That just wasn't true for our study. So we saw a mixture of herd sizes, but for our resilient farms, they tended to be on the smaller size. And then on top of that, our resilient farms did a better job at retaining profit. So for every dollar that they spent, they got $1.20 back, compared to our non-resilient farms that for every dollar they spent, they got $1.07 back. So we were able to see that there were real differences in resiliency. We also wanted to look at how net farm income on average changed between the two. So here you can see this red line is our resilient farms, this gray line is our non-resilient farms. And what we found that was interesting is our resilient farms are willing to give up some of that potential higher profit during years when milk prices are high in order to ensure in years where milk prices are low that they aren't losing income and that they're still remaining profitable. And where we really see that in this picture here and in this graph is in 2018. That's a prime example. So 2018 in Minnesota, to give you some context, the average cow lost $58, or the average dairy farmer lost $58 per cow in Minnesota. So not a great year for our dairy farmers out here. Our resilient farms, only 2 out of the 24 had negative net farm income. For our non-resilient farms, 40 of the 36 had negative net farm income. So our resilient farms really are willing to ensure that they are making a profit when milk prices are low and are willing to give up some of that potential upside when milk prices are high. So now that we know that resilient farms are different, we had this other challenge of how does one merge the data to be able to replicate the sensitivities and to be able to create this comprehensive data set. So what we did here is we used 3 different weighting mechanisms. I'm just going to quickly go through one so you have an idea. The first one was equal weighting, and we'll go through an example of that. Then we used performance groups and volume of production. So the goal behind these weighting methods was, how do we take these farm level finances and bring it down to the individual cow? So how do I assign an expense from that farm level expense to that individual cow, accounting for the fact that not all cows have the same expense. So we're not just going to take that total expense and divide it by the total number of cows. So to give you an idea of how we did this under one method, we said that our cow expense for an individual cow was equal to the farm expense, the total farm expense. We divided that by the sum of all of the days that the cows were in lactation. So if you had 100 cows in your herd, you might have one cow that's in there for the full year, one cow that's only in there 214 days before they get culled. We took the sum of that, divided by that total farm expense, and then for each cow, we multiplied it by the days that they were in lactation. And that gave us, for each individual cow, their share of the farm finances and how much belonged to them. So we did this using 3 different methods. Equal weighting method, which we just talked about. We did it using performance groups. So we broke them into a high and low performance group. And then we did it that way. And we also used volume of production. So how much energy corrected milk is that cow producing? And doing this allowed us to be able to merge those 2 data sets together and to take that cow level data and use it with farm financial data in the same data set and get some real information. So this still hasn't answered the question, though, what factors affect resiliency? So I'm going to let you all go ahead and text in. If you were in my shoes, we had just over 2,000 different variables measured between the cows, those farm finances. What factors would you want to look at that affect dairy resiliency? Go ahead and text your answers in. Feed costs, yep. Animal health, absolutely. Labor, absolutely. Labor again, okay. The larger the word gets, the more that people have typed it in. Debt, yep, absolutely. Drought, great one. Animal growth, absolutely. So there are all of these different factors that we could have looked at. And what we decided to do is to really narrow it down based on previous research and previous journal articles, and then also what we had been hearing from our dairy farmers. So I've presented this maybe half a dozen times, and every time we get feedback on different things to look at. So we broke them down into 5 categories. The first category that we looked at for our variables that could affect resiliency was human resources, the age of our dairy farmer, their educational opportunities, whether or not they have the second generation on the farm, and also their hired labor expenses. We then also looked at animal health. So we looked at how much milk the cows are producing, the percent protein, percent fat. We looked at feed costs. We looked at the herd's death rate and the herd's cull rate. We also looked at herd structure. So how big was their herd? How many acres per cow did they have? The percent of crop acres that they owned, and then those percent of cows that hit their break even. So how many cows in the herd hit their break even? How many cows in the herd did not? We also looked at financial indicators. So that debt to asset ratio, and then working capital per cow. And lastly, this was suggested by farmers. We looked at technology adoption. So we looked at whether or not they raised replacement heifers, and then this variable that we called proactive dairies. If they did 3 of those 6 different options on there, they would get an indicator that said that this is a proactive dairy. So using all of these explanatory variables and our resiliency measure, we went ahead and ran a regression, essentially looking at what's the relationship between these factors and that dairy resiliency, and what is setting those 24 farms that we see apart from the others. What are they doing differently? Well, what we found that sets resilient farms apart the most is seeking educational opportunities, building that team of experts, having a plan, and maintaining working capital. These had the largest positive impact on resiliency across all of the farms. So we'll go into depth on these. So for that educational variable, in Minnesota, we have something called the Minnesota Dairy Initiative. This variable had the largest impact on resiliency. To give you some idea of those 24 farms that we had that were resilient, nearly 16 were in this Minnesota Dairy Initiative. And what it does is it's a producer-led initiative that coordinates a comprehensive approach to the delivery of on-farm services. So the big benefits behind this that we're seeing is, one, it encourages farmers to seek out educational opportunities. So these farmers were more resilient because they were going to educational programming. And then two, the other big benefit that came with this was relationships. Through this program, they used a team approach. So oftentimes farmers would have a team that they would rely on and check in with regularly. This could include a nutritionist, perhaps their vet. Some of these teams included a farm business management instructor, maybe their lender. So that was really the key here that had the largest impact on whether or not a dairy was resilient in the long term and was able to remain in that top 24% all the way from 2012 to 2018. So I guess my question for all of you is, who is on your team? And I will, oops, my apologies. So I'll give you all just a second. If you want to text in, think for just a moment about who is on your team. Who can you work with in your community to build those strong relationships? Nutritionist, great. Nutritionist, perfect. Vet, absolutely. Nutritionist. Great, we have lots of nutritionists out there. Neighbors, absolutely. Your neighbors can be great resources. Extension, absolutely. Folks within your community. Maybe you have a very experienced senior farmer, or maybe you have somebody in your co-op. The fact that you're here right now at this Young Cooperators conference getting education probably is a good sign that you're on your way to being one of the more resilient dairy farmers. Cooperative extension, accountants, yes, 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 absolutely. All of those are great custom harvesters. Yep. Nutritionist, vest, accountant, community, co-op, peers, lenders, absolutely. Thank you all for your responses. And then the other thing, which we're not going to type in today for time, but think about who else could be on your team. Who might you be missing in order to make sure that you have that really holistic team? So just take some time, think about that one on your own. And then just to get through some of these other things that we found that on top of this educational team approach, some other big impacts was that resilient farmers, they had a plan and they stuck to it. We saw this in a variety of different factors, but one that I like to point out because it's really visually easy to see is cows sold and cows culled. So when we're looking at the percentages of cows culled, here we have that dotted line is our resilient. That's the dotted red. And then this solid gray line is those farmers that consistently fell into the lowest 25%. And when milk prices were bad, they culled more of their cows compared to our resilient farmers had a plan and they stuck with it. Even though milk prices had changed, they weren't necessarily going to change their plan. They weren't going to change their culling schedule. They were going to stick with it. And you can see that here too, as milk prices tanked, the percent culled in that bottom 25%, that lowest 25, increased significantly. The other thing that we found with resilient farmers is that they value quality over quantity. Their milk quality premiums over volume. So our resilient farmers actually produced less milk than our non-resilient farmers, even when we took into account farm size. But they had higher amounts of fat, and also they had higher protein levels. Additionally, our resilient farms increased cow longevity. So even though it took longer for their cows to reach their break even because they weren't producing as much milk, they stayed in the herd on average 150 days longer than non-resilient farms. And in that time, they were able to make up for the additional time that it took them to hit their break even though they were making less milk, they were able to stay in the herd longer, which ultimately helped with profits. And then on top of that, maintaining working capital. As you can see here, our resilient farms really tried to maintain working capital as long as they could. 2018 was a hard year, but definitely maintaining that working capital per cow was really important for our resilient farms. And I am about out of time. So with that, I will turn it over for any questions.
Thank you, Amber. We have some questions in the queue here. First one was from Brittany. What was the largest herd size used in the study?
1,115 cows. So the nice thing about this that I think might apply to a lot of folks here is we consistently heard from our small dairy farmers in Minnesota that they just felt like there wasn't research done for them and that it wasn't applicable. So we really tried to be intentional with this. Average herd size for us was just over 280, but we ranged all the way from 22 at the lowest to just over 1,000 at the highest. And it was good because a lot of the comments that we received from farmers is they felt heard and felt like they had some data for them and some information that they could use for our smaller farms.
Okay. A question from Josh. Was there any difference in farm size as an acreage or any other farm income like grains or cash crops versus small farms that only had milk as an income when it came to resilience?
So we were able to see which farms were dairy and which were dairy and crop. There actually wasn't a big difference when it came to resilience. So out of those 24 farms that we had that were resilient, 7 of them were dairy and crop. The rest were just sole dairy. And then we looked at in the study percent of crop acres owned. So how much land did they own that they were versus how much did they rent? And it didn't really have a statistically significant difference, which means that farmers who rented more land versus farmers that had their own land, it didn't affect resiliency. Was off-farm income taken into consideration? Yes, so we were able to not necessarily see if the one question that we had with that is we wanted to know, and we've heard a lot from farmers with this off-farm income, was do they have insurance? That we weren't able to answer. We were able to see if they were using off-farm income and how much they had, and that was factored into those finances. And we were able to take that into consideration. It didn't necessarily have an impact, but the majority of the farms that we were working with did use off-farm income.
We have a question. Throughout the study, is there any way that your team or you measured the risk management that was being used on farm?
Throughout the study, was there anyone that used risk? I'm not entirely sure.
Measured risk management. So the farmers, are they undertaking, or to what extent are farmers using risk management tools on the farm? Is that something you measured?
No, we weren't able to measure that. We know that folks, we were able to see, and all of these farms that were part of it were part of Finbin. So they all work directly with the farm business management instructor, which means that they have somebody that they're consistently connecting with, consistently talking about their finances with. So I would assume that they have talked about risk management for the most part. I don't know exactly what tools they're using. I always assumed that because I only had 200 cows, I'd never be able to compete with 1,000+ cows. Thank you for this research. Thanks, Josh. That's a great comment. That's what we've heard a lot of from farmers, is kind of this idea that just because they're small, because they don't necessarily have the economies of scale that they believe that larger farms have, that they can't compete. And this just really showed us that that's not necessarily true. By any stretch. Now, if we're talking 5, 10,000 dairy cows, I can't tell you, we can't extrapolate that far out. But we had dairy farms that had 800 cows, 1,000 cows, all the way down to ones that had under 100 that were able to consistently across the board in high prices in 2012, 2013, and low prices in 2017, 2018, remain profitable, while other farms that had many more cows weren't.
Well, thank you, Amber. This has certainly been very informative for me, and I'm sure for the rest of the participants as well. Just as a reminder to the participants, this will be available as a recording for everyone. I know it went pretty fast, and there was a lot of information to cover in a shorter period of time. A question for Amber, I guess, would you be willing to share your slides with the group as well?
Absolutely.
Myself or Teresa, and we can get it out to the group. With that, I think we're running close on our time. Thank you once again, Amber, for joining us and participating in the panel today. With that, I'll turn it back to Teresa.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks so much, Amber. That was a great presentation, and we're so glad you were able to join us today.